The morning of June 6, 1944, dawned gray and turbulent over the Normandy coast, and within hours, the most meticulously planned amphibious invasion in military history had shattered against the German Atlantic Wall. Yet the fortress Europe that Hitler had promised his people, the impregnable barrier of concrete and steel that would hurl any invasion back into the sea, crumbled with shocking speed. The fall of France's northern coastline in a single day represented not merely a tactical defeat, but the culmination of systemic failures, strategic miscalculations, and organizational paralysis that had been building within the German military apparatus for years. Understanding why the Wehrmacht failed to repel the Allied landings requires peeling back layers of dysfunction that extended from the highest echelons of Nazi leadership down to the confused soldiers manning bunkers along the beach. The Atlantic Wall itself, despite its fearsome reputation, embodied the first fundamental flaw in German defensive planning. Stretching nearly 3,000 miles from Norway to the Spanish border, this supposed barrier consisted of 15,000 strong points, bunkers, and artillery positions, yet its very scale guaranteed its weakness. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to inspect coastal defenses in late 1943, had been horrified at what he found. The wall existed more as propaganda than reality. Impressive fortifications clustered around major ports like Calais and Cherbourg, but vast stretches of coastline remained virtually undefended. The Wehrmacht had neither the concrete, steel, nor manpower to fortify every beach, every cove, every potential landing site along such an enormous perimeter. Rommel understood that the invasion could come anywhere, but Hitler and the High Command remained convinced it would target the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel and the most direct route to Germany's industrial heartland. This assumption would prove catastrophic. The German command structure on the eve of D-Day resembled less a unified military organization than a collection of competing fiefdoms, each jealously guarding its prerogatives. Hitler had systematically destroyed the Wehrmacht's cohesion by creating overlapping authorities and encouraging rivalries among his generals. Supreme Commander West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, technically controlled all forces in France, but Rommel's Army Group B operated with considerable autonomy. The Luftwaffe answered to Hermann Göring, the SS Panzer divisions reported to Heinrich Himmler, and Hitler himself retained personal control over the strategic reserve, the panzer divisions that would prove crucial in any counterattack. This fractured command meant that on June 6th, as Allied paratroopers dropped inland and landing craft approached the beaches, no single German commander possessed the authority to coordinate a comprehensive response. Rommel and von Rundstedt had spent months arguing over defensive philosophy, a debate that exemplified the paralysis infecting German military thought. Rommel, scarred by his experiences in North Africa, where Allied air supremacy had made daylight movement suicidal, advocated defeating the invasion on the beaches. He wanted panzer divisions positioned close to the coast, ready to counterattack within hours of any landing. Von Rundstedt, representing the traditional German doctrine of mobile warfare, believed in holding armor in central reserve, allowing the enemy to land, then destroying them with a massive concentrated counterattack. Hitler, characteristically, chose neither plan decisively. He compromised, positioning some panzer divisions near the coast under Rommel's control while holding others, including the elite 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division in reserve around Paris, close enough to reach any invasion site, yet far enough that they required Hitler's personal authorization to move. This compromise ensured the worst possible outcome: insufficient forces for beach defense and a strategic reserve too far away to intervene quickly. German intelligence failures compounded these command problems. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been thoroughly penetrated by Allied agents and fed a steady diet of misinformation through the double-cross system. Every German spy in Britain had either been captured and turned, or was a double agent from the beginning. The fictional 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton and massed in southeastern England opposite Calais, existed only in radio transmissions and carefully leaked documents, yet the Germans believed utterly in its existence. Even after the Normandy landings began, the Wehrmacht High Command remained convinced for weeks that the real invasion was still coming at Calais, that the fighting in Normandy was merely an elaborate diversion. This delusion froze the German 15th Army in place, its divisions idle around Calais, while the battle for Normandy raged 100 miles to the west. Had these troops been committed to the actual fight, the outcome of D-Day might have been dramatically different. The intelligence failure extended to fundamental misconceptions about Allied capabilities and intentions. German commanders knew an invasion was coming. The buildup in southern England was too massive to hide, but they convinced themselves it could not come in early June. Weather forecasts predicted storms in the Channel, making amphibious operations impossible. When the storm arrived on June 4th and 5th, forcing Eisenhower to postpone the invasion by 24 hours, it seemed to confirm German meteorology. Rommel felt secure enough to leave his headquarters and drive to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to press Hitler personally for control over more panzer divisions. The commander of the 7th Army, responsible for Normandy, held a map exercise in Rennes, far from the front. The 15th Army's commander was in Brussels. When the weather briefly cleared and Eisenhower ordered the invasion to proceed on June 6th, the German leadership was scattered, disorganized, and psychologically unprepared. The Luftwaffe's absence from the skies over Normandy represented perhaps the most visible symbol of German failure. Once the pride of the Wehrmacht, the force that had terrorized Europe in the war's early years, the German Air Force on D-Day could muster barely 100 sorties against an Allied air armada of over 13,000 aircraft. The Allies achieved total air supremacy, and this single fact, more than any other, determined the day's outcome. German pilots, undertrained in flying obsolete aircraft, were simply overwhelmed. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt B F-109 fighters that had dominated European skies in 1940 now faced Allied aircraft superior in almost every measure, faster, more maneuverable, flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of training that German pilots no longer received. The systematic destruction of German aviation had begun years earlier with the combined bomber offensive, the round-the-clock strategic bombing campaign that forced the Luftwaffe to concentrate on defending the Reich itself. By mid-1944, the majority of German fighters were committed to intercepting Allied bombers over Germany, not protecting troops in France. The fuel crisis compounded the problem. Germany's synthetic oil production, already strained, came under sustained attack from Allied bombers in the spring of 1944. By June, aviation fuel was desperately short. German fighters sat on airfields, unable to fly for lack of fuel, while Allied aircraft operated virtually unopposed. The handful of German planes that did reach Normandy on D-Day found themselves vastly outnumbered, hunted by swarms of Allied fighters. Pilots who survived the experience described it as suicide. The Luftwaffe's tactical squadrons in France, even when they possessed fuel and aircraft, faced another insurmountable problem. Allied fighter bombers had made daylight movement impossible. Any German aircraft taking off was immediately spotted and attacked. Airfields themselves were under constant assault. Allied bombers had spent weeks before D-Day systematically destroying every airfield within 150 miles of Normandy. German aircraft were forced to operate from bases deeper in France, reducing their time over the battlefield and increasing the likelihood of interception. The absence of air cover left German ground forces naked and vulnerable. Allied naval gunfire, delivered by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers positioned offshore, pounded German positions with impunity. Ships like the USS Texas and HMS Warspite fired their massive guns throughout the day, each shell weighing as much as a small car, demolishing bunkers that had been designed to withstand anything but direct hits from such weapons. German troops huddled in their fortifications, unable to maneuver, unable to observe the battlefield properly, unable to call in their own artillery support effectively because Allied aircraft immediately attacked any German guns that revealed their positions. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers, even those in well-fortified positions, felt isolated and helpless, cut off from support, watching as an armada of thousands of ships unloaded troops and equipment onto the beaches below. The vaunted Atlantic Wall, without air cover and naval support, became a trap for its defenders rather than a shield. Rommel had predicted this with chilling accuracy months earlier. The enemy will probably succeed in creating bridgeheads at several different points, and in achieving a major penetration of our coastal defenses. Once this has happened, it will only be by the rapid intervention of our operational reserves that he will be thrown back into the sea. This requires that these forces should be held very close to the coast. But Hitler had not listened, and now the reserves sat immobile, waiting for authorization that would not come for critical hours. The command confusion reached its surreal peak in the early morning hours of June 6th. The German radar network, which might have provided early warning of the approaching armada, had been systematically degraded by Allied jamming and bombing. Operators who did detect the massive fleet approaching Normandy found their reports disbelieved or dismissed. When American and British paratroopers began dropping inland after midnight, German commanders initially interpreted the scattered drops as a relatively minor operation, perhaps the insertion of sabotage teams. The dispersion of the airborne divisions. Many paratroopers dropped miles from their intended zones due to heavy anti-aircraft fire and pilot error, actually worked in the Allies' favor by spreading confusion across a wide area. German units reported parachutists everywhere, creating the impression of a massive airborne assault, when in fact the drops were chaotic and disorganized. By the time the seaborne landings began at dawn, German commanders were already overwhelmed by contradictory reports, uncertain about the scale and objectives of the invasion. The 7th Army's headquarters in Le Mans did not even learn of the landings until several hours after they began, a failure of communication that demonstrated the breakdown in German command and control. When Field Marshal von Rundstedt finally grasped that a major invasion was underway, he immediately requested permission to move the panzer reserves toward Normandy. Hitler's headquarters refused. The Führer was asleep, and his staff would not wake him for what they believed might still be a diversion. Not until afternoon did Hitler authorize the movement of the reserve panzer divisions, and by then, precious hours had been lost. Even once authorized to move, the panzers found the journey to Normandy a nightmare. Allied air supremacy transformed what should have been a 12-hour march into a multi-day ordeal of destruction. The panzer divisions tried moving during daylight and were savaged by Allied fighter bombers, Hawker Typhoons armed with rockets, P-47 Thunderbolts carrying bombs, and countless other aircraft that hunted any vehicle moving toward the front. The Typhoon, in particular, became the terror of German armored columns. Its rockets, while inaccurate, could penetrate even heavy tank armor when they struck, and the psychological effect of diving aircraft firing rockets was immense. German tank crews learned to camouflage their vehicles during the day and move only at night, but nighttime movement brought its own problems. Slower progress, difficulty maintaining unit cohesion, and the Allies owned the night skies too. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, one of Germany's best formations, spent June 6th trying to reach Normandy from its position south of Paris. It covered barely 40 miles. Panzer Lehr Division, moving from the Chartres area, was caught in daylight by Allied aircraft and suffered devastating losses before ever reaching the front. Its commander reported losing over 200 vehicles to air attack during the approach march. By the time significant German armored forces reached Normandy, the Allies had established firm beachheads, brought up anti-tank guns and artillery, and dug in. The moment for a decisive counterattack that might have driven the invasion back into the sea had passed. The German panzer divisions would fight with characteristic ferocity in the coming weeks, but they would be fighting to contain the invasion, not to destroy it. The quality and readiness of German forces defending Normandy itself revealed another dimension of German failure. The divisions holding the coast were a mixture of formations. Some, like the 352nd Infantry Division positioned at Omaha Beach, were relatively well-trained and well-equipped units, and they inflicted terrible casualties on American troops landing there. But many coastal divisions were static formations, composed of older men, soldiers recovering from wounds suffered on the Eastern Front, or conscripted troops from occupied territories whose loyalty to Germany was questionable. These Ostlegionen, battalions of Poles, Russians, and other Eastern Europeans pressed into German service, surrendered in large numbers once the invasion began. The 716th Infantry Division, Holding the Sword Beach area included Georgian and Polish battalions that melted away when fighting started. Even German units suffered from poor training and inadequate equipment. Artillery pieces were often captured French, Russian, or Czech weapons, requiring different ammunition types that complicated logistics. Many units lacked sufficient transport. Horses remained the Wehrmacht's primary means of moving supplies, a fact that seems almost medieval when contrasted with the fully motorized Allied armies. The vaunted Navalwerfer rocket launchers, which should have devastated densely packed landing craft, were too few in number and poorly positioned to have decisive effect. Rommel had tried to compensate for these deficiencies by turning the beaches themselves into killing grounds. He ordered the placement of millions of mines, thousands of obstacles on the beaches, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, concrete tetrahedrons, all designed to rip open landing craft or impale vehicles. He flooded fields inland to hinder paratroopers. In the 6 months Rommel oversaw coastal defenses, he transformed Normandy into a more formidable defensive position than it had been. But there was never enough time, enough resources, enough workers to complete the work. The Atlantic Wall remained fundamentally incomplete on D-Day, its weaknesses often concealed by propaganda, but starkly revealed by battle. The German Navy's utter inability to contest the invasion highlighted another dimension of comprehensive failure. The Kriegsmarine had virtually ceased to exist as an effective surface force by 1944. Years of attrition, the Royal Navy's dominance, and the disastrous losses of major warships had left Germany with only a handful of operational ships. The Channel itself was effectively a British lake, patrolled by destroyers, motor torpedo boats, and minesweepers that ensured no German vessel could threaten the invasion fleet. German torpedo boats based in Cherbourg and Le Havre did attempt a few sorties on D-Day night, but they were quickly driven off by Allied destroyers, accomplishing nothing. The German U-boat force, which had nearly strangled Britain in the Battle of the Atlantic, was by 1944 losing that struggle decisively. New Allied escort tactics, improved sonar and radar, long-range patrol aircraft, and the breaking of German naval codes had made U-boat operations increasingly suicidal. When the invasion began, U-boats stationed in French Atlantic ports tried to break out and attack the Allied fleet, but they found the approaches heavily patrolled. Allied aircraft sank several U-boats before they could even reach the Channel. A few submarines managed to penetrate the invasion area, but the massive Allied anti-submarine screen, including specialized hunter-killer groups, ensured they achieved little. The age of the U-boat as a decisive weapon had passed. The Kriegsmarine's impotence meant that the Allies could operate an invasion fleet of nearly 7,000 vessels, from battleships to landing craft, virtually without naval opposition, an operational freedom that simplified the already complex invasion plan immeasurably. The absence of Rommel himself during the crucial opening hours deserves particular attention. The Desert Fox, as Allied propaganda had dubbed him, was Germany's most capable defensive commander, and perhaps the only German general who fully understood the nature of the threat facing the Reich in the West. His decision to leave Normandy for Germany on June 5th seemed reasonable at the time. Weather forecasts made invasion improbable, and he desperately needed to confront Hitler about the deployment of reserves. But his absence created a vacuum in command at the critical moment. Rommel's energy, his ability to make rapid decisions, his understanding of Allied capabilities, might have enabled a more effective initial response. Instead, his chief of staff and subordinate commanders, lacking Rommel's authority and decisiveness, hesitated, waited for guidance, followed procedure when the situation demanded improvisation. When Rommel learned of the invasion, he was hundreds of miles away, unable to influence events, racing back to his headquarters in a staff car. He would not arrive until evening, by which time the Allies had secured all 5 landing beaches and were pushing inland. His memoirs and papers from this period reveal his anguish at being absent during the decisive battle. Later, he would reflect that the war was lost on June 6th, that once the Allies established their foothold in France, German defeat became inevitable. His prediction proved accurate, though he would not live to see it. Wounded by Allied aircraft in July, then forced to commit suicide in October after being implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler. The German defenders fought with varying degrees of determination and effect across the 5 landing beaches. At Omaha Beach, the American troops faced the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit that had not been expected to be in position. German intelligence failures worked both ways. The Allies had not realized this division had recently moved to the area, and the Americans landing at Omaha walked into a far stronger defense than anticipated. The result was a bloodbath. German machine gunners positioned in bunkers and strong points on the bluffs overlooking the beach had perfect fields of fire across the sand. Mortar and artillery teams had pre-ranged every meter of the beach. When the first wave of Americans landed, they were cut down in appalling numbers. The water turned red, bodies piled up on the sand, landing craft burned. For hours, the outcome at Omaha hung in the balance. And had the Germans been able to reinforce this sector quickly, they might have thrown the Americans back into the sea. But reinforcements never came. The German regimental commander at Omaha called desperately for armor support, for reserves, for anything that might help him destroy the invasion force on his beach. No help arrived, isolated and without support. Even the excellent 352nd Division could not prevent determined troops from eventually fighting their way off the beach. By afternoon, American units had penetrated the bluffs and begun pushing inland. At the other beaches, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, resistance varied, but was generally lighter. The 716th Static Division at Sword simply could not match the firepower being directed against it. British and Canadian troops pushed inland steadily, though failing to reach their optimistic first-day objectives, like the city of Caen. The German defenders at Utah Beach faced American paratroopers to their rear and seaborne troops to their front. Caught in a vice they could not escape. By nightfall of June 6th, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops and established beachheads varying from a mile to 5 miles deep. The failure of German armor to launch an immediate powerful counterattack during D-Day itself represented the decisive missed opportunity. German doctrine emphasized the immediate counterattack, the violent riposte that catches the enemy disorganized and vulnerable. Had the panzer divisions been positioned as Rommel wanted, close to the beaches, they might have struck the Allies while their forces were still disorganized, supplies still being unloaded, artillery still coming ashore. The first hours after an amphibious landing are the most vulnerable for the attacker. Units are intermixed, command structures are confused, heavy weapons are scarce. A powerful armored attack during this window might have achieved what firepower alone could not. But Hitler's compromise deployment meant the panzers spent D-Day driving toward Normandy rather than fighting in it. The 21st Panzer Division, the only significant armored formation close to the beaches, did launch a counterattack late in the afternoon against the British at Sword Beach. The attack achieved some initial success, penetrating to within sight of the coast, but then faltered. British anti-tank guns knocked out numerous panzers, and as evening fell, the sight of a massive glider stream, the second wave of British airborne troops landing, unnerved the German commanders, who feared their division might be cut off. The 21st Panzer withdrew to defensive positions. This limited attack represented the only significant German armored action on D-Day itself, and its failure demonstrated the impossibility of dislodging an established invasion with a single division. Multiple panzer divisions, attacking in coordination across several sectors, might have achieved something. But such an attack never materialized, and once June 6th ended with Allied forces firmly ashore, the opportunity was lost forever. The psychological dimension of German failure deserves examination. By mid-1944, the Wehrmacht was an exhausted, overstretched force. Holding an empire, it no longer possessed the strength to defend. The Eastern Front consumed the bulk of Germany's military resources. Over 2 million German soldiers were engaged against the Red Army, fighting a brutal war of attrition that bled the Wehrmacht white. The best divisions, the newest equipment, the priority for replacements and supplies, all went east. The forces in France were considered a secondary theater, and they knew it. Morale among troops stationed in France was reasonable. It was certainly better than on the Eastern Front, but few German soldiers believed anymore in ultimate victory. The defeats in Russia, the relentless bombing of German cities, the loss of North Africa and Italy, the sinking of the U-boat fleet, all pointed toward inevitable defeat. When the invasion came, many German soldiers fought with the courage and skill expected of them, but there was a fatalism in the German ranks, a sense that they were merely delaying the inevitable. This was not the Wehrmacht of 1940, flush with victory and convinced of its invincibility. This was an army that had been fighting for 5 years, that had suffered over 3 million casualties, that had been forced to conscript 16-year-old boys and 50-year-old men to fill its ranks. The Allies who landed in Normandy were fresh, well-equipped, supported by an industrial base that produced weapons and supplies in quantities Germany could not match. Every German soldier in a bunker watching the invasion fleet arrive understood at some level that they faced an enemy with effectively unlimited resources. Hitler's personal culpability for the defeat at Normandy cannot be overstated. His interference in military operations, his insistence on personally controlling strategic reserves, his refusal to trust his generals, his addiction to elaborate fortifications rather than mobile defense, all these factors contributed directly to the German failure. Hitler's strategic vision by 1944 had become increasingly divorced from reality. He believed in miracles, in wonder weapons, in the notion that fanatical will could overcome material disadvantage. He forbade retreat under any circumstances, ordering troops to hold positions that were tactically untenable. He wasted resources on massive concrete fortifications when those same resources could have produced thousands of panzers and aircraft. His racial ideology poisoned military calculations. The insistence on committing SS divisions to combat roles rather than using them purely for internal security diverted resources, and the continuing diversion of logistics and rolling stock to the final solution's death camps, even as the military situation deteriorated, demonstrated his twisted priorities. On D-Day specifically, Hitler's decision to sleep in and his staff's refusal to wake him for the invasion squandered precious hours. A functioning command structure would have had standing orders to release the Panzer Reserve in case of major invasion without waiting for the Supreme Commander's personal authorization. But Hitler had systematically destroyed such initiative in the Wehrmacht, demanding personal control of major decisions. The result was paralysis at the moment when speed and decisiveness were most needed. The Allied deception operations deserve recognition as a crucial element in German failure, even though they were an Allied success rather than a German mistake. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate plan to convince the Germans the invasion would come at Calais, succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation. The fake army group in southeastern England, the careful radio traffic, the dummy tanks and landing craft visible to German reconnaissance, the turned agents sending reports about preparations opposite Calais, all of this created a fictional order of battle that the Germans believed completely. Even after June 6th, the High Command remained convinced that Normandy was a feint, that the main assault by Patton's army group would strike Calais once the Germans committed their reserves to Normandy. This belief kept the German 15th Army frozen in place for weeks, its divisions idle, while the battle raged to the west. Had these troops been available on D-Day, or in the days immediately following, they might have contained or even crushed the Allied beachhead. But Hitler and his intelligence services had been so thoroughly deceived that they could not recognize the truth when it landed in front of them. The German faith in their own intelligence services, despite their complete penetration by Allied agents, represented a failure of critical thinking at the highest levels. Warning signs were visible. The execution of several spies in Britain should have raised questions about network security. The consistency of reports pointing to Calais should have seemed suspiciously convenient. But the Germans saw what they wanted to see, and the Allies encouraged every misconception. The tactical performance of German forces on D-Day was uneven, but often impressive given their disadvantages. Individual units fought skillfully and inflicted serious casualties on the attackers. The Germans who manned bunkers at Omaha Beach, for instance, were not superhuman soldiers. They were ordinary infantrymen, armed with machine guns and a good defensive position. But they used that position with deadly effectiveness, coming close to stopping the American landing entirely. German snipers, scattered throughout the defensive zone, picked off Allied officers and caused constant anxiety among attacking troops. The Germans employed their limited artillery with considerable skill, shelling beaches and concentration areas, even as Allied counter-battery fire tried to silence them. Small unit leadership at the German company and platoon level was generally good. Junior officers and NCOs, many veterans of the Eastern Front, knew their business and fought tenaciously. The problem was not tactical competence at the small unit level, but strategic and operational failure at higher levels. Individual courage and tactical skill could not compensate for being outnumbered 5-1, for having no air support, for fighting without hope of reinforcement or relief, for serving a command structure so dysfunctional that it could not even identify where the main battle was occurring. German after-action reports from units engaged on D-Day speak to this frustration. Local commanders reporting their positions as critical, requesting support, and receiving nothing, or being told that help would arrive tomorrow, which invariably meant too late. The logistical dimension of German failure often receives less attention than command decisions or tactical outcomes, but it was equally decisive. The Wehrmacht's logistics system in the West was fragile and inadequate even before the invasion. Transportation infrastructure, railroads, bridges, roads, had been systematically targeted by Allied bombers for months before D-Day in what was called the Transportation Plan. Every major rail junction, every bridge across the Seine and Loire rivers, every marshalling yard in northern France came under sustained attack. By June, the French rail network was so badly damaged that moving supplies and troops to the front had become extraordinarily difficult. Even when the panzer divisions received orders to move to Normandy, actually getting them there was a logistical nightmare. Fuel shortages compounded the transportation crisis. The Allied bombing of synthetic oil plants meant that gasoline was desperately scarce. Panzer divisions often had to halt their march toward Normandy simply because they had run out of fuel, waiting hours or days for tankers to arrive. Ammunition supplies faced similar problems. The extraordinary expenditure of ammunition in combat meant that stocks had to be constantly replenished. But getting ammunition to the front when the railroads were wrecked and every road was under air attack proved nearly impossible. German units often found themselves rationing ammunition even during critical battles. The contrast with Allied logistics was stark. The Allies brought their supplies directly over the beaches, establishing an efficient system for moving material from ship to front. The Mulberry harbors, prefabricated ports towed across the channel, enabled the unloading of thousands of tons of supplies per day. The Allies had planned meticulously for the logistical challenge of supplying a major army across open beaches, and their system worked. The Germans, defending from prepared positions with established infrastructure, found their logistics collapsing under Allied air interdiction. This reversal, the attacker having better logistics than the defender, was unprecedented and reflected the degree to which Allied air power had reshaped the fundamental conditions of warfare. The German military intelligence service's failures extended beyond the strategic level to tactical intelligence on D-Day itself. Reconnaissance flights over the invasion fleet in the Channel during the night of June 5th and 6th should have provided warning of the Armada approaching, but the few German reconnaissance aircraft that did fly had trouble distinguishing the massive fleet through clouds and darkness, and their reports were delayed in reaching commanders. Radio intercepts of Allied communications might have provided valuable intelligence, but German signals intelligence capabilities had atrophied while Allied capabilities had grown. The Enigma machine, which Germans believed provided unbreakable encryption, had been compromised years earlier, meaning that the Allies could read much German military communication, while the Germans remained largely blind to Allied intentions. On D-Day morning, German commanders had only a fragmentary and confusing picture of what was happening. Reports arrived in no particular order. Paratroopers here, gliders landing there, ships off this beach, explosions in that area. Assembling these fragments into a coherent picture of the invasion was difficult, and the command structure's dysfunction meant that by the time higher headquarters understood the scale of the operation, critical hours had been lost. Compare this to Allied intelligence, which had detailed information about German dispositions, knew the locations of most major units, understood the command structure and its weaknesses, and had broken German military codes. The intelligence war was over before D-Day began, and Germany had lost it decisively. As night fell on June 6th, the magnitude of German failure became undeniable. The Allies were ashore in strength, with over 150,000 men landed and more arriving every hour. The Atlantic Wall, the supposedly impregnable barrier, had been breached at 5 points. German forces were in disarray, scattered formations trying to form defensive lines, reserves still hours away, no coherent counterattack possible. In the weeks to come, the Wehrmacht would fight with its characteristic tenacity in the hedgerows and villages of Normandy, inflicting heavy casualties and slowing the Allied advance to a crawl. But the opportunity to defeat the invasion decisively had passed. The failure to throw the Allies back into the sea on the first day meant that the Allies could build up their forces faster than the Germans could reinforce. The mathematical logic of attrition now favored the Allies overwhelmingly. Every day that passed saw more Allied troops, tanks, guns, and supplies landed in Normandy, while German reinforcements arrived slowly, battered by air attack during their approach. The battle for France would continue for months, but its outcome was determined on June 6th, when the combination of Allied planning, material superiority, and air dominance met German command dysfunction, intelligence failure, and strategic paralysis. The German failure on D-Day was not a single mistake or missed opportunity, but the culmination of systemic failures that extended across every dimension of military operations: command, intelligence, logistics, strategy, and tactics. The Wehrmacht of 1944, overstretched and exhausted, fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with superior resources, led by a dictator whose strategic judgment had long since departed from reality, could not have prevented the Allied landing. The defenses that might have made Normandy impregnable would have required resources Germany no longer possessed, and a unity of command Hitler's system made impossible. The Atlantic Wall was a fortress without a garrison adequate to defend it, commanded by generals without authority to act decisively, supported by an air force that no longer existed, and a navy that could not contest the seas. The failure on D-Day was not merely military, but reflected the exhaustion of Germany itself, a nation that had overreached catastrophically, and now faced the consequences of its leaders' megalomaniacal ambitions.